Welcome to today's podcast. Today, it's a real pleasure to welcome Praveen Chakravarty to the program. Praveen, like many of the people I've featured on these podcasts, has worn many different hats. In other words, he doesn't have a singular vision of the problems of the global economy, but he began his career, or he began his work in India with a degree in computer science, then a Wharton MBA in finance, worked with IBM and Microsoft before turning to investment banking, and finished up his investment banking career by bringing BNP Paribas Securities to India, which was a very major coup in terms of the world of finance. Then he worked for the government of India on its financial inclusion program through the Aadhaar, or the ID program that has now connected 1 billion Indians, the largest such program in the world, to give people access to the formal system. Then he's also been an angel investor, and then worked at the same time as I did at a think tank, the IDFC Institute. We were both senior fellows there in the middle part of the last decade. And that's when we worked together on a project on spatial inequality, which I hope that we will have a chance to speak about in this conversation. And most recently, he has turned to politics, joining the Indian National Congress, India's oldest political party, as a senior head of data analysis and the chairperson of that department of the party. So he's worn many hats: the think tank world, the world of finance, and the world of politics, and really looking forward to gaining some of his insights on the questions that we often talk about in this podcast. Welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you with us. I've already done the intro, so the audience knows your many accomplishments, Praveen. And you're a man of many parts. You wear many hats. So you have worn many hats: finance, government, think tank world, where we met and worked together, and now finally politics. So let me start with just a broad question. India began its kind of journey into the global economy in 1991, the famous reforms that Dr. Singh was a finance minister. You've worked with him closely now for the last couple of years. And then we've had kind of ebb and flow, if you like, of reforms since then, another spurt of reforms then under perhaps the first NDA government. Under the kind of 10 years of Dr. Singh as PM, one view of that is that there was a shift then towards thinking about providing foundations of reform by creating important entitlement-based welfare programs, whether it's food, housing, employment. And then now we've had almost 10 years of the Modi government, lots of ups and downs, the very unorthodox demonetization experiment, some reforms, technical reforms, for instance, monetary policy and bankruptcy. So, but without going too much down in the weeds, Praveen, what's the big picture if you were to kind of summarize or look over 30 plus years of reforms in India? And the reason I ask the question is not just because of India, but given the global picture. India is now the world's largest country, fortiori the world's largest democracy. And so therefore, this kind of tussle between politics and economics that happens in India, that reforms can be painful, therefore difficult politically to implement, that isn't something that the Chinese have to worry about, at least not directly. I mean, if there's massive protest on the street, then it creates a problem. But fundamentally, I think India, therefore, is a good exemplar now for the global South, for other big emerging countries, Brazil, South Africa, that are democracies. So let me just throw that out to you, Praveen.
Thank you, Vivek. See, I think without, and I don't want to be kind of partisan or be political here today. And I'm going to speak more as a political economist, someone who's traversed both the worlds of economics and currently in politics. Now, I think if you look at the long arc of 3 decades or so since the 91 reforms, I think it's fair to say that India has shown the world that it is possible to reform when you have over 1 billion people and do it democratically and do it over successive governments of different hues. So, and I think that is actually an optimistic takeaway. A cheer on I mean that's definitely a cheerful kind of lesson for democracies across the world. Now, we may quibble, squabble here and there about the nitty-gritties, but broadly speaking, if you think about reforms broadly, which is opening up to the world in terms of trade and measured as trade as percentage of GDP, then in terms of liberalization of capital flows and people, I mean, that. And then the third is broad privatization, reducing state share of the economic activity. I don't think there's been a substantial reversal of direction in either, in any of these. Across governments and across policies. Yes, the degrees may vary, how the methods may vary, but I don't think that's changed very fundamentally. So to that extent, I think India continues to reform, but because India is a democracy, and it's a very, very, very complex and messy democracy, I always say, as you know, that what's much less understood about India is its political diversity. There are 26 political parties at any given point in time that can rule, that can govern a certain state in India. And it's almost unheard of in any other democracy. So we're not just a democracy, but we're a very complex democracy where it's not just two political parties on either side of the spectrum that are in contention. There are various regional parties. So given this, any sort of change is bound to be incremental, is bound to be slow. And hence, there are people that get frustrated, exasperated with the pace of change. But I will say that there is change, there is continuity in economic policy. And yes, would I have liked to have seen faster privatization in the last 10 years? Yes. But have I seen a reversal in stance on privatization? No. We continue to privatize. I mean, the latest example being Air India, the national carrier. So I don't think there's a fundamental change in direction. And I think that is something that we must acknowledge. And I think the reason for that is it is now well accepted by people of India that the reforms were good. They were good for prosperity of the average Indian. Of course, there's a big, huge caveat there. There is inequality, both spatial and individual, that reforms may have played a role in, and I hope we can talk about that later. But and that is something that we must consider, especially as politicians, for who every vote is every person has exactly the same value, which is one vote. So equality is important for political economy. So I think there is some concern around what's happening in terms of who are gaining, who are the people that are gaining from reforms. If you say, for example, talk about trade, the terms of trade, who benefits and who loses. I think there are some broad questions around it, and that's not just in India, as you know. I mean, that's there across the world. Ironically, in America, I think both the Republicans and the Democrats talk about economic nationalism now. So I think there are questions around that are beginning to erupt in India. Then there is also, when we talk about trade and liberalization of trade, we must, at least after COVID, we must understand the geopolitical reality, which is trade has been weaponized by some nations, such as China. When you have countries like China that dominate global trade, that are the workshop of the world, and then they start to weaponize that in terms of supply chains, then there is, again, as politicians, we start to wonder if we should be cautious. We should be cautious about trade. So I think there are these sort of questions, one on just inequality, and then the second is geopolitical and geoeconomic concerns that are now starting to rise, both, again, across the world, but certainly in India. And I hear that even within my own party, as well as across political parties.
Thank you for that, Praveen. And of course, a lot to unpack in what you said, a very rich answer. Let me just underline one point that you made, I think, which I think is crucial for the continuity of reforms or the general belief in a more liberal economy, which is that in 1991, as you'll recall, it was a very tough sell for the Rao government, for Dr. Singh, to make the case that liberal economic reforms are good for everyone, not just for the already rich and the capitalists and so on. There was a lot of pushback from the left parties, the communist parties at that time. And yet, as you say, now 3 decades later, or really, I think within the first decade or so, there was I think, a broad consensus in India that the reforms had been good for everyone. It pulled everyone up, and millions were lifted out of poverty. But as you correctly highlight, now in the last couple of years, and certainly part of our work, which I do want to talk about, there are concerns about spatial inequality, and let's come to that in a moment. That's the work that we began together. Individual inequality, in other words, rising Gini coefficients. So could you maybe speak to that? That one view of inequality kind of come from a Milton Friedman kind of libertarian perspective. Well, who cares if people are doing better? If everyone's getting better, if poverty is going down, kind of the sort of Bhagavati view, let's say. The other view would be, well, no, because if you have massive inequalities of wealth and income, that corrodes the politics as well. And we've seen that in different places. I mean, in the US now, basically you have to either be a billionaire or have billionaires backing you if you want to make a run for the White House. So perhaps you could speak both to the 2 points that you raised. Let's hold off on spatial inequality as a separate topic, but sort of what are the corrosive effects of large and increasing wealth and income inequalities, which I think we'll have to concede, at least in part, are due to liberalization of trade, technological change. And then if you can talk a bit about just the geopolitics that you mentioned, very, very important since COVID. And in particular, can India, I mean, the theory is that everyone wants to de-risk and shift some of the global supply chains away from China, which is weaponized, as you say. Is India going to be a big winner? I mean, Apple is increasing its presence in India. So is that kind of a one-off, or could this be a very good for India going forward, Praveen?
Sure. On the first question on inequality, individual inequality, not so much spatial, I think that is a real concern. I think that is a very real issue. And I have written about this. I have said, I mean, the data is abundantly clear. Headline GDP growth does not translate to incomes, job opportunities, or prosperity for the average Indian. And that's a fact. So, and that is because we look at labor, I look at labor market data, which is not very easy to come by in India. So we look at proxies like demand for unemployment insurance through the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program and things like that. And it's, I mean, it's actually, the striking point is India is hailed as the world's fastest growing economy right now. Last quarter, India was hailed as the world's fastest growing economy. I can tell you, demand for unemployment insurance through the NREGA program was the highest in a decade in India. So the two absolutely coexist. And what does that tell you? And that's very striking. It is an undeniable fact that I think income inequality, at least economic growth, as we've traditionally known, as we've traditionally measured through GDP, does not translate into meaningful incomes and livelihoods for people. Now, so as politicians, we have to really worry about this. So we are now starting to pay less and less attention to economic growth, to growth. And in fact, I've started to argue that maybe growth maximization should not be an objective, but minimization of labor market distress should be the objective of economic policy. Because there used to be a time when when the economic growth theory kicked in, as you know, there was a feeling that it would translate into prosperity and incomes for everybody. But it is a fact that it does not, and there is the gap between the mean and the median is only growing. And I know there's some dispute in your part of the world and in America about, are we measuring inequality? I saw the latest economist saying, is inequality really rising? And I think they're quibbling about post-tax incomes and things like that. I don't know about that. I can't speak for that. But in India, I can tell you that labor market distress is very evident. Very evident. And, there are lots of reasons for that, lots of reasons for why economic activity does not have to translate into jobs and incomes. As one is clearly technology, right? Technology and mechanization and automation. The second is, some would say trade. Trade is an important factor that is contributed to jobless growth, as we call it. Whatever the reasons may be, we're stuck in a quandary here, because politicians that don't necessarily understand economics, let's say in my own party, they say we don't believe in GDP growth or economic growth anymore. So unless and until we have some concrete ideas for generating jobs and incomes for people, we would have to resort to welfare mechanisms. We would have to resort to, I think, what some people may call populist measures. But the problem, and this is where I think it is very important for the profession of economics to step up. I think first, the profession of economics has to acknowledge that somewhere this correlation is broken. The Washington Consensus, 1990 Washington Consensus, is perhaps no longer working, at least in developing countries like India. I noticed that your friend Danny Roderick has launched a project in Harvard Kennedy called Reimagining the Economy, where he's got philosophers and sociologists and anthropologists and economists and politicians to talk about how we should kind of rethink about the economy. And I actually think that is an initiative like that is very much needed, even in India. So, and all of this is because it comes from inequality. And this will absolutely play into politics. And unless we have some solutions quickly, I'm afraid that we will have to turn the cycle back on the classic Washington Consensus reforms and neoliberal consensus. So, and that is, and we're at that stage right now. We don't have answers, but we absolutely need to think hard about this. I think your second question was about the geopolitical
from China, and could India be a beneficiary of that in some way?
Yes and no. So the way we look at it is there are two big shifts in the global order. One is we're going back to some sort of a Cold War bipolar world order. The second is the transition to mobility, transition in mobility from fuel to electric. Both are almost a given. I don't think anybody contests both these shifts. Now with that, so there is a natural kind of reluctance to do business with China for the West. And hence India comes up as an alternative. India can be an alternative only if it is a strong, well-functioning democracy with a harmonious society and massive investment in in capital investment in activities such as manufacturing, production, and things like that. So in that regard, in fact, my leader, Mr. Rahul Gandhi, actually quoted at Stanford. He said that Indian democracy is a global public good, in the sense that India's democracy is needed for the world in this kind of shift, because we're the sole democracy that can align with the West, but we need to be able to compete economically with China so that we can actually help the democratic side of the bipolar world order. So I think what you're seeing right now is some shift from China to India. That's more spillover. I'm not sure we're ready yet to kind of be the replacement for China, certainly not in the next 5 years or 6 years. It requires massive amounts of investment, but it also requires a stable society and a functioning democracy. And I think all three have to align for India to be able to do this.
No, well said, Praveen. And I would just maybe underline or pin what Mr. Gandhi said, which is indeed India's democracy should be a global public good. Although, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of democratic backsliding. I mean, there have been a number of, half a dozen coups in Africa in the last couple of years. Thailand has seen coups, Pakistan, and it's we don't have to talk about this. There's so much we can chat about, but there's this peculiar sort of reality that in many emerging countries of the global South, kind of the middle class, prosperous middle class, seems to be opting for a non-democratic form of government because they think that that will reduce corruption. And I don't think it's correct. I think that they're misguided, but it's at least noteworthy that, despite all of its flaws and warts that, that you and I both know, Indian democracy has been remarkably robust, resilient, and has somehow managed to, roughly keep moving in the same direction. So I think I wanted to underline that. I want to come back maybe towards the end, Praveen, talk a bit about climate change. But let me first, we must talk about our work that we started together. And I remember that kind of moment we were in the IDFC office at Raymond House at Churchgate, looking at the Sigma convergence, and I think we both almost fell off our stool, looking at the big breaking point in 1991. And although we could not prove it, kind of in some scientific way that would convince the skeptics, it was pretty clear to us that the big uptick in spatial inequality, and that's been much until our work that some people have worked on it. You mentioned, we mentioned some names. Could you speak to that, because that raises a different political economy question that we have now in India the reality that much of so-called Hindi heartland, North India, is much poorer, and corresponding social indicators are much worse. It's the most populous. It also happens to be kind of the heartland of the current ruling dispensation. And you've also got now, in a sense, people living in two countries. As we pointed out, someone in Bihar versus someone in Kerala or Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, living at kind of middle income levels. So that creates a huge problem. At the time we did our research, apart from pointing out this rising spatial inequality, we raised alarms about the fact that states had fewer levers now to deal with these problems. And we talked about the GST kind of centralizing the tax at the level of the union. So do you want to kind of bring us kind of up to speed on what is your current thinking about spatial inequality? We haven't had an opportunity, to kind of update our data, but what's your sense? Is the problem getting worse? Has the GST been an impediment to kind of fiscal federalism? If you could speak to that broader question, Praveen.
Certainly. In fact, this is actually, in some sense, one of my kind of main issues or warnings that I continue to talk about publicly, both in my capacity as a public intellectual and as a politician. And it's not easy for me to talk about this as a politician, because immediately I get labeled as someone who wants to divide the country, and someone who, it's a very hostile environment for us to be able to raise this. But I will say this, Vivek, that since the time we did our research, the issue of federalism, or the concerns over federalism, has only gotten graver. And we called it, I mean, our work looked at it primarily from economic spatial inequality and diversity, if I can use that term. Now, but then, you have to kind of overlay India's, of course, natural, cultural, and social diversity, but also political diversity, right? And then kind of look at it from an economic lens. So what has happened is, and COVID actually proved this, states had fewer levers, right? I mean, so India today has, of its 30 states, Indian states elect their own government and what we call chief ministers, but they have absolutely no sole powers of taxation. Real powers. I mean, they have a few, like, property and some sin taxes, but they don't have sole powers of direct or indirect taxes. So in a sense, they have almost no levers, and we're probably the only democracy where we actually elect a head with no taxation powers. It's almost the reverse of the American independence slogan, which was representation without taxation. No, here we have representation without taxation powers. So, and during COVID, this was very obvious, because what happened was, to be able to meet the demands, healthcare demands of their people, state governments were starved of funds. They had to depend on the union government, on the federal government, for funds. And the federal government turned around and said, we can't give you the GST revenues, because we need it ourselves, because this is a pandemic and we didn't expect this pandemic. So we didn't account for it. We didn't budget for it. So in some sense, the state had to deal with it without any funds. Some states, ironically, what they ended up doing was, during the lockdown, they started reopening liquor shops. Everything else was shut, but liquor shops were opened. Why? Because that was the only source of revenue that the state governments could lay their hands on, so that they could get some money to and don't miss the irony here. They wanted people to drink to solve a health pandemic. So and that's really where we are today, when in terms of federalism and what GST has done. Now, to your question on whether it has widened spatial inequality, we don't know the data yet. I don't have updated data, but I can tell you that it has certainly worsened the relationship between states and the federal government. The tension is now very palpable. So India's federalism, in a sense, is at a precipice. Is quite, and the states are increasingly coming to the conclusion that they cannot. This is not sustainable, where they are given the responsibility to govern a state with absolutely no revenues, or no ability to levy taxes and raise revenues. So I think this is a real problem. Where this will amplify is India's political diversity. Because India has regional parties, at some point, regional parties are going to, and these regional parties are only concerned about governing their state, because most of these regional parties are confined to the boundaries of one state. So at some point, they're going to say, okay, we're only concerned about our state. We don't care about GST, or we need more powers. And at some point, this thing is going to come to a head, and that's what my fear is, which is not very far from, I think, what we had expected or predicted, if you recall.
I do, and what you say certainly sounds worrying. So, again, just as a quick follow-up, I mean, what we're at the edge of the kind of precipice, as you say. Do you see it heading to perhaps a constitutional crisis where states try to reassert the power to tax, or a, a civil unrest? But if there's increasingly a disjuncture between what's happening at the center and what's happening with the states, particularly the states ruled by regional parties, uh, I mean, just briefly, where do you think this is heading?
See, I think right now it's just being held together very loosely by, certain threads of revenue guarantees, and it so happens that the ruling BJP is also in power in many of the Hindi heartland state, and so they have some sort of a high command kind of culture where they tell the states to obey. But I think where I see this going is there are two things that have already happened. The Supreme Court ruled last year or earlier this year, I can't remember, that the decisions taken at the GST Council, which is a council set up to take decisions on indirect taxes, are not binding on states, which means this opened up a completely new window that earlier people thought these were binding on states. And the Supreme Court said India's constitution does not permit these decisions to be binding on states. So at some point, some state is going to say, oh, we're not going to obey or comply with the decisions taken at the GST Council. We're going to either increase or decrease tax rates for certain products within our state. At which point, the entire idea of GST kind of goes away, and the sanctity of the GST Council gets questioned and the credibility of it. I see that happening, perhaps after the next general election, depending on how state finances progress.
And just one quick follow-up. I promise you what you're saying is so interesting that I have to keep coming back with follow-ups. But one quick follow-up, and then I'll turn to kind of a last question. The other thing that we pointed out, and I remember a conversation we recorded in the IDFC with Ruben Abraham, the CEO, talking about kind of this tension between the fact that states that have done well have, for instance, have lower mortality, lower fertility, and therefore population growth is much lower. And therefore, what the Americans call when the next redistricting occurs, delimitation exercise occurs, obviously the states that in some sense did well are going to be punished by having a smaller share of seats in the Lok Sabha. So how does one, and as it happens, again, the ruling party is also, as you pointed out, dominant in the poorer Hindi heartland states that are more populous. So presumably it's in their incentive to do this exercise, as soon as possible. Where do you see that going? And then what are the debates around delimitation and this tension between, you're in some way being penalized for doing well?
No, it is a hugely contentious issue. I suspect that the delimitation will be put off because I think this is too risky a move for India and in its current state. The fact is that say in 1960, the average person in Bihar and the average person in Kerala were roughly the same age. Today, the average person in Bihar is 21 years old and the average person in Kerala is 35 years old. It's more half a generation apart. So, and what this tells you is the gap is only widened, and it's only widening, and there is no convergence, but there is divergence among states. If that is the case, then to continue to take decisions such as delimitation or redistricting based on parameters like population and per capita GDP or whatever it may be for the Finance Commission, that would be hugely problematic. So my expectation is that India will put off its delimitation exercise.
Interesting, interesting. One final kind of broad question, Praveen, which is that one of the kind of paradoxes of the kind of global politics and economics, global situation, is that we have many global issues such as climate change, for instance. Right now, we're in the middle of COP28. Some are calling it COP out 28. Uh, but if you look around the world, you have massive migration flows. You have on the southern and eastern borders of Europe, the southern U.S. You have what looks like worsening climate situation, and again a real tension for the countries of the global south, including India, because India, uh, whether we agree that it's either GDP or job creation, that is going to be carbon intensive uh, for for some time. We don't yet have the completely clean technological solution to this problem. Uh, so how do you see, for instance, I mean, India, and I think this is I think kind of a nonpartisan issue, or in other words, I think there's broad consensus that there has to be some balance struck between climate change mitigation efforts, for instance, in India, and the need to continue economic activity, for not just for growth's sake, but for employment, for social harmony. What's your view of that? And I must say I remain fundamentally pessimistic that this divide, can be bridged between the rich countries of the North or the West and countries of the global South. What's your sense of that? Or just more broadly, Praveen, if you can speak to this fact that we have a global political economy which doesn't have overarching global institutions that can fix problems or at least start working on problems like climate change, migration crisis, and so on, Praveen.
Yeah, I think this is a very complex issue, as you would imagine. But I mean, so for one, I think climate change is real. So before I say anything, that people shouldn't think I'm a denier. So let me put that out pretty clearly. But I think for India, for developing countries such as India, it is complicated. I'm not sure. I think there are a few things that have happened. I think most fundamental thing that's happened is, like as you alluded to it, that you don't have global institutions to drive this transition. I think uh, I would add to it and say that whatever institutions, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions that are there, I think they've lost a lot of credibility. They've lost a lot of credibility, at least among developing nations. They're seen as hypocritical. They're seen as unempathetic to developing nations. And so you're right. There are no institutions that can actually that have the trust and the credibility of developing nations such as India to be able to handhold this transition. Uh, I think what is perhaps a likely path for India, for countries like India, is not to lecture us, not to give us mandates in terms of how much we decarbonize. It is a real problem even for us. We recognize that, but then we have to balance. The way I see us doing something about this is to make us a significant part and a player of the economy of this transition. So, for example, if mobility is transitioning to electric, let India play a big role in the supply chain of electric mobility. Let us, for which we need huge amounts of investment, technology. Let us start by mining for some minerals and rare earths that are critical for the transition. Let us start with the technology that is needed to process these. Let us start with battery technology. Let us start with make us a part of the supply chain so that we see economic benefits. And hopefully we can use some of those to transition ourselves. So, and I think that we have to take an economic view to this for India. And I actually do think that there is a significant opportunity for India to play a big role in the supply chain, in this transition, economically, especially as the Western nations get increasingly reluctant to deal with China. So, so my suggestion, or at least the way we are thinking about it, and I've written about this also, is India can play a significant role in this supply chain, in the transition, as a player, as an economic powerhouse, and by the way, also try and reduce carbon footprint and transition ourselves. And I think that's probably the way to do it. I know I've heard some people talk about, say, is it time for, and this includes actually, this is really Mr. Gandhi's idea, which is, okay, is it time for, say, something like a Marshall Plan equivalent? Are we there in terms of, significant investments from, say, Western nations, maybe America, into India, but for this, to make India a significant counter to China in the democratic world and in the transition to electric. So I think there are some of these things that we need to think about carefully, but lecturing or giving mandates is not really going to do the work.
And I absolutely concur with that. I know we could go on forever, Praveen, so much more to talk about, but I want to thank you very much for joining the conversation today. And sure that it will be widely appreciated and widely shared. Thank you, Praveen.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. My pleasure, Vivek. Thank you.
Thank you.